Heyo! Welcome, guys. Today we're going to do a little chatting about imperialism. I'm glad to have you all here today. Not that you have an option. So today we're going to actually look at the introduction to imperialism in China. So let's do a little bit quick of a refresher what we've been talking about. First, we got this glorious age of exploration, right? In the late 1400s, 1500s, we got these dudes sailing all over the world, exploring things, in the quest for gold, glory, and God. Primarily gold, right? And so we've taken that, we've talked about that, and the discovery that Vasco da Gama made to India. Portuguese had an appearance in India, and then the British East Indian Trading Company shows up in India as well. And so then, right, this British East Indian Trading Company basically says, hey, we'll pay you guys to be our soldiers, come work for us, and then eventually they kind of take over the entire country. All right, and so this is in the 1600s into the mid 1700s, right? So as we're getting into the mid 1700s, trade and expansion is starting to grow all over the place. Now, the British have not fully taken over India quite yet, but in the mid 1700s, but the British East India Company pretty much has, right? It was like in the mid 1700s, the English government had control of BIC in London, but they didn't have control of them in India. So they basically had control of India at this point in time. So now they're continuing the trade because China was hot, right? There was lots going on in China. They had lots of great goods. So we're looking at the mid 1700s again, right? And so let's look at that today. We've got all these people going out there to trade, and one of the things we have is the Portuguese, right? First ones out of the gate, first ones over into India, and so they're actually starting to trade as well, and they make their way over the next few hundred years. We see a lot of expansion, a lot of trade, and the Portuguese make their way over to Macau, right? And so all of these different countries here that we see on the board, they've all established colonies in different areas of Asia. They've all began their expansion process. And again, right, as Asians, you can't be super psyched about these people colonializing your own land, right? Coming in and kind of taking over. But, you know, there are some pros and cons, which we've already talked about in class extensively. All right, so essentially China, right? So around the 1300s, mid 1300s, all the way up to mid 1600s, we have the Ming Dynasty, and they're running the show in China. And so this was during the age of exploration. In fact, there was even a number of guys who came out from China who were great explorers, but the Ming Dynasty began to start this level of isolationism, right? Where they actually called back some of their explorers and traders and said, you know what, I think some of these Europeans are getting out of hand. Let's start kind of closing off a little bit. But as we all know, the Europeans, due to the Silk Road and all that kind of stuff, they love their silk, right? And so they loved the goods that China was producing. And so in the mid 1600s, a group from the Manchuria area of China comes and invades the Ming Dynasty and basically overthrows them, and they establish the Qing Dynasty in Beijing. The Qing Dynasty would rule over China from 1644 to 1911. So this is the height of European imperialism in China. Is basically under the Qing Dynasty. And there's a couple of actual emperors we're going to look at more specifically. Now, if you look here on the map, you can see the area that Manchuria comes from and the overall empire of the Great Qing Dynasty. One of the guys we're going to look at a lot is actually going to be Qinglong. Qinglong was the emperor in the late 1700s, like the 1790s, and he's an older dude but looked young, and like I guess they say he was like 83 but didn't look a year over 60. But he also was the one that handled the McCartney case, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, we're going to look at Xiaoqing, I hope I'm saying that right, who basically was the son of Qianlong from 1796 to 1820, which was, as some of you guys may know, like the beginning of opium usage in China, and so we'll also break that down a little bit later. So, imperialism in China. The early European traders were seeking Chinese goods that they could make a profit from by selling them in Europe, right? So those early traders, they loved themselves tea, silk, porcelain, and other decorative items, right? They loved that stuff. But they really didn't have much that China wanted, right? And so they had, gold, silver, precious jewelry, and they also had opium, which later, obviously, the Chinese would want, much to their own chagrin. So basically, Portugal had a place in Macau. The British were trying to get into Macau. They weren't able to get into Macau as much as they wanted, and so they were starting to want to get into more of the mainland China area. And so China is seeing this encroaching from Europe time and time again, and was just like, nah, we're not having any of it. And so they actually, in 1757, the Chinese government attempted to restrict foreign trade. So this is important. We need to be taking in mind the dates, right? When we're looking at historical context, making sure we're keeping in mind, like 1757 was when they started to restrict it, and they came up with something called the Canton system. So this Canton system basically required foreign companies to trade with a Chinese merchant collective. This Chinese merchant collective, I don't know if it's showing up, but my mouse is underlining it, was called a Hong. And Canton was this area in modern-day Guangzhou, was the only area that foreign traders were allowed to come to trade, right? So they could only go to Canton, and they could only trade with these Hongs. And basically what ended up happening then because of that, right, they had no connection. They weren't trading with the Chinese government, only with this Chinese port in Canton, all under Chinese law. So these Hongs basically were getting taxed by the government out the wazoo, and because they're getting these big taxes, then that went back to the British, and they're like, hey, we're getting taxed, you got to pay these fees as well. The British were like, man, this is too expensive, we don't want to have to pay this. This is the worst. And so basically what the Chinese wanted, or what the British wanted, was they wanted the Chinese to ease up on this Canton system. They wanted to be able to trade at other ports all over China, and they wanted representation within China. They want, they had a number of things they wanted, and we're going to look at that. We look at the McCartney case in a little bit. But basically, it was like, hey, China, we would really like it if you would allow us to trade outside of just that place right there in the Hong Kong, Guangzhou area. They wanted to be able to go to other places. Did the Canton system work for them? No, right? Ultimately, it ended up failing because, well, you'll see. All right. Which leads us to the McCartney Embassy case study activity. So Lord George McCartney was this dude that was sent over in an embassy from England, right? The King George was like, hey, we want you to go over. Now here's what's key, right? So let's flip back here for a second. So 1757, the Chinese government attempted to restrict foreign trade, right? Implementing this Canton system. So all of a sudden, one of these cash cows that the British government has is actually getting restricted. Now, in 1776 to like 1783, there was this huge war that broke out in the Americas. If you guys know those dates at all, the colonies that they had established in North America were revolting. And those colonies ended up becoming the United States. And so this huge cash cow for England there basically had dried up, right? So in 1783-ish, like mid-1780s, the money that they were making from the States was drying up, and so they needed other sources of income. And that was another reason why England was not down with the Canton system, where they're not okay with it. So King George sends this group of people over to talk to Qianlong, the emperor of China at the time, basically get this guy to loosen the reins a little bit. And so the next thing we're gonna do in this class is we're gonna look at this whole McCartney embassy. And so this is one of the more fascinating events in history. It's not a war, it's just a delegation going to another country But there's some historians that argue that this is one of the largest impacts as far as East-West relationships, the introduction of industrialization in China, and how this plays out had a huge impact on historical implications as a whole. And so we're going to take some time, I want you guys to take some time actually, to look at this as we look at some of the primary documents and some of the reasons why or how everything went down.